Well, welcome back, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to, and an honor as well, to introduce our next speaker, Professor Oliver Crisp, who is currently Professor of Analytic Theology and Director of the Logos Institute for Analytic and Exegetical Theology at St. Mary's College, where he joined the Divinity School in 2019. And he previously taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, University of Bristol, and also the University of St. Andrews. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Philosophy of Religion at Notre Dame University and the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton. And I know Oliver Crisp from his time at Notre Dame, where he, I think, was writing on original sin at the time, if that's right. A fellow in the center, and I was just an ignorant visiting grad student. And but despite that, I think we had a lot of fun together. And I even had Oliver over for dinner at one point with his family, and miraculously he survived my cooking. So I'm glad to have him here today. He's best known, my bio says here, he's best known for his work on analytic theology, but I think that's a bit of an understatement. He is the very founder, I think, together with Mike Gray, of that field. And he's also currently editor of the Oxford Studies in Analytic Theology, which appears yearly. Well, he organizes lots of conferences, for example, the annual Los Angeles Theology Conference series with Professor Fred Sanders, and also a co-chair of the Christian Systematic Theology Unit for the American Academy of Religion. So a lot of things going on there. Wonderful to have you. And today, Professor Crisp is going to speak about metatheology. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. It's lovely to see you with such a splendid beard as well. Fantastic. Outstanding. It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be associated with the Kuyper Center at the Free University. So this is great. I'm just going to plunge straight in, and we'll talk about metatheology, and I'll say something about progress in theology as well. So metatheology is the study of the foundations of theology. Its nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds. More expansively, metatheology is concerned with the nature of theology, that is, what it is in distinction from other disciplines, such as the social scientific study of religion. It's concerned with the aims of theology, that is, what the goals of theology are, how they're ordered. Is concerned with the methods of theology, that is how the theologian goes about the task of theology and on what basis. Is concerned with the scope of theology, that is the extent to which theology reaches. And it's concerned with the bounds of theology, that is the boundaries that mark out where the domain of theology ends or gives way to other disciplines and approaches. These distinct aspects of metatheology are often conflated. Indeed, metatheology itself is often misunderstood or mischaracterized where it's identified at all. So it's the task of this paper to give a brief account of metatheology. Because this is an area of such misunderstanding, confusion, and dispute, much of the paper will be concerned with trying to clear the ground in order to provide a proper characterization of metatheology. Given the conceptual proximity of metatheology to analytic theology, it also seems appropriate to say something about the relationship between metatheology and analytic theology and how they're different. And in the second part of the paper, I do just that. And then applying this analysis to the perennial question for theology, the third section considers whether theology is a progressive discipline. I conclude with some reflections on the importance of this discussion for the study of theology as such. Okay, first section. Let's begin with some ground clearing. Some might think that as I've characterized it thus far, metatheology is just the philosophy of theology, just as metaphysics is the philosophy of metaphysics. Well, that's indeed my view, but at least on one way of thinking about it, but it's a view that's contested. Some divines will deny that there's a conceptual space outside the bounds of theology where we can contemplate and reflect on the nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds of theology. For as they draw the boundaries, theology has to do with God and all things in relation to God, which is a broad scope indeed. Let's call this sort of approach the theologically expansive sensibility. On this way of thinking, there's no non-theological space from which we may regard the nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds of theology. For any such putative space would already be within the purview of theology, so to speak. In a similar manner, philosophers these days speak of metaphysics, But if that's equivalent to the philosophy of first philosophy, then it's still philosophical reflection of a sort, just philosophical reflection on the foundations of philosophy itself. The meta of metaphysics does not place it in some putatively objective space outside philosophy, from which the philosopher may assess the merits of metaphysics as a species of philosophy. With this in mind, we could characterize the expansive sensibility like this, and here I am now going to slip into the dramatis personae of the defender of the expansive sensibility. They might say something like this: if theology is about God and all things in relation to God, then there's no field of human endeavor, no intellectual discipline or science that falls outside the scope of theology. To search for the foundations of theology, as if those foundations are something distinct from theology, on which it stands like a great monument whose foundations lie deep in the earth, is to mischaracterize theology. For theology has no foundations in this sense. That is, no foundations that are distinct from or lie outside the domain of theology, so to speak. In the case of theology, the space that is given as the purview of theology is the created order. That is all that is not God. So there's God, and then there is all that is not God, which God creates and which depends on God for its continued existence thereafter. Theology concerns both of these things. It's concerned with God and all that is not God, the creation, in relation to the one that creates all these things. And there's nothing besides this that the theologian must take account for on this conception of things, there can be nothing more than God and all that is in relation to God. Once we've accounted for God and all that exists in relation to God, we've accounted for all there is. But that is what theology concerns itself with. So there is no metatheological view from nowhere. To speak of what you're calling metatheology, Crisp, is already to think that from within the bounds of theology. It's to reflect on the foundations of theology from within the bounds of theology, rather like the cosmologist who, in pondering the singularity from which the universe sprang, thinks about the origins of the cosmos from within the cosmos as one of the constituents of the cosmos. We cannot exit theology to ponder its foundations in some philosophical antechamber. To think otherwise is to misunderstand the nature of theology. That's the story. Thus, according to the defender of the expansive sensibility, metatheology is a kind of category mistake writ large. Now, as I've expressed it here, the person who takes this sort of view thinks that theology concerns God and all things in relation to God. This expansive vision of theology is often ascribed to Thomas Aquinas and has recently been reiterated with approval by two of my, one late colleague and one current colleague here at St. Andrews, namely Professor John Webster and Professor Judith Wolfe. But in fact, this does not appear to be the view of Thomas Aquinas, or at least not without qualifications that alters the picture before us in significant respects. To see this, we'll need to briefly consider what Aquinas says at the beginning of Summa Theologiae in part 1, question 1, on the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. Over the 10 articles he tackles there, he makes several distinctions that are pertinent to our concern. In the first article, he distinguishes between theology that falls under the description of first philosophy or metaphysics, and theology that falls under the description of revealed theology. Aquinas thinks that theology is a term, the description of which ranges over a wide domain that is not discipline-specific. It includes a part of first philosophy or metaphysics that, according to Aristotle, has to do with matters pertaining to God. In other words, the aspect of metaphysics that considers questions of God's nature and existence is, by Aquinas' lights, theology. It's properly described as theology for it's concerned with the being and nature of God. We might call this the metaphysics of theism. Now, it's important to note at this juncture that Aquinas is not denying that the metaphysics of theism is philosophy. He concedes that point. Thus, in the resolution to Summa Theologiae 1:1:1, Aquinas says this, and here's a quote: "I answer that it was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God besides philosophical science built up by human reason." Later in the same passage, he says this: "It was necessary that besides philosophical science built up by reason, there should be a sacred science learned through revelation." That's the end of the quote. But clearly, This presumes that there are two distinct intellectual domains in view, that of philosophy, which approaches matters of theology via ratiocination, and that of sacred doctrine, that approaches matters of theology via an appeal to the authority of divine revelation. His concern is to show that the study of theology spans aspects of two distinct intellectual disciplines, including the aspect of first philosophy that has to do with the metaphysics of theism. Put differently, he thinks that the metaphysics of theism does indeed address itself to theological questions, so there is an area of philosophy that is concerned with theology. However, in addition to this, there is the subject matter of revealed theology. Although Aquinas seems to think that human beings may come to proper theological conclusions pertaining to theology without divine revelation, revelation is, he thinks, a more expedient way of communicating such lofty truths. And in addition, human ratiocination without the corrective of divine revelation is liable to turn up falsehoods mixed in with true theological claims. He says this, even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered, it was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation, because the truth about God, such as reason could discover, would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, with the admixture of many errors. Thus Aquinas. So revealed theology is a way of guarding against theological mistakes as well. Given that our salvation depends on rightly apprehending these things, as Aquinas puts it, it was expedient that God provide a more secure route to understanding matters of theology, and that is provided by divine revelation in Scripture. Now, setting to one side the rather optimistic account of human cognition that this approach presumes, and focusing on the matter in hand, it seems clear from the foregoing that in answer to the question of whether there is an area of philosophy that's properly theological, Aquinas answers in the affirmative. Theology is not discipline-specific, in his view, any more than mathematics belongs to mathematicians to the exclusion of physicists. On the matter of sacred doctrine, he avers that revealed theology is a fitting, indeed expedient means of communicating the truths of the faith that otherwise might be difficult for human beings to arrive at through sheer ratiocination alone. Thus, the importance of revealed theology is in the delivery of the truths that comprise sacred doctrine, and that would not be communicated as effectively or without the likelihood of significant error if the means of arriving at these truths was via philosophy alone. So it appears that according to Aquinas, there is philosophical theology, which is just the philosophical discussion of that which falls under the description of theology, done using the natural endowments provided by reason, independent of divine revelation. The subject matter of philosophical theology, according to Aquinas, is the metaphysics of theism. Presumably, the results of such investigation are theological truths arrived at by philosophical methods. This he contrasts with revealed theology, which is a surer way to theological truths because revealed theology is a divine communication of those truths to humanity in Scripture. Thus, the results of revealed theology are theological truths arrived at by means of divine communication, which yield sacred doctrine. Put in a more mundane idiom, the idea Aquinas has in view here seems to be something like the difference between learning about some famous person and receiving a written communication from that famous person. If I learned about the Queen of Great Britain, that is, through careful investigation, I might learn all sorts of things, but plausibly not all of them would be true. It would be an admixture of truth and falsehood, and some things I might not be sure about. For instance, the provenance of the information might be dubious, or might be had on the basis of hearsay, or whatever. However, if I received a detailed letter from Her Majesty, then other things being equal, I can be much more sure of what is communicated in the letter. It's a more expedient and perhaps a more secure way of accessing information that might otherwise be difficult to obtain if it could be obtained at all. Now, what's important for our purposes is that this way of thinking about theology, culled from Aquinas, presumes two things. These are, A, that there are bounds to theology that distinguish it from philosophy, and B, that theology may be pursued on philosophical grounds as well as on what we might call confessional theological grounds. That is, via reflection on the deposit of divine revelation in Scripture as a kind of divine testimony. It's in this context that Aquinas speaks about the subject matter of theology later in Article 7 of Question 1 of Part 1 of the Summa Theologiae, in the familiar terms of God and all things in relation to God, when addressing the question of whether God is the object of the science of sacred doctrine. But what does he actually say there? In providing his resolution to the article, he writes, God is in very truth the object of the science. But in addition to God, the subject matter of theology also includes what he calls things and signs, the works of salvation, and what we would think of as the totus Christus, that is Christ and the members of his church. Of all these things, in truth, we treat in this science, says Aquinas, but so far as they have reference to God. It's from this that the principle of God and all things in relation to God is derived. However, and importantly, in context, it's clear that the scope of theology to which Aquinas is referring in Article 7 is the content of sacred doctrine, which in turn is the subject matter of the Summa Theologiae itself. But equally clearly, this is not coextensive with the subject matter of theology as such, because he allowed earlier in his treatment, as you recall, that theology is a broader term that includes both the content of sacred doctrine, which is revealed theology, as well as some of the content of metaphysics, which is first philosophy. If we were to sum up Aquinas' position here, we could say that he conceives of theology as a general, non-specific area of intellectual inquiry that includes the discipline of confessional theology, as I've called it, which is what he calls the study of sacred doctrine, as well as philosophy. By contrast, sacred doctrine or confessional theology is a discipline-specific area of intellectual inquiry which derives from theological reflection on the authority of divine revelation in Scripture. Thus, even if the claims that theology concerns God and all things in relation to God does properly express Aquinas' aspiration concerning the scope and shape of theology, when this is qualified by what he says about the scope of theology and sacred doctrine in particular, it's clear that he does not think this means there are no philosophical grounds on which to take or to make theological claims. Quite the opposite. The confessional theology generated by the study of sacred doctrine is indeed about God and all things in relation to God. But how we get at truths about God is a more general question, which is not discipline specific. It may be done by at least one of two routes, philosophically and/or theologically. Clearly, this is not the same as claiming that there is no non-theological space from which to assess theological claims, or even that talk of the foundations of theology in some putative metatheology fails to get off the ground because there is no non-theological vantage from which to make that assessment. Now, up to this point, I've been concerned to rebut a particular objection to metatheology, namely the one mounted by the defenders of the expansive sensibility. If I'm right, then the expansive sensibility of at least some Thomists is not, in fact, synonymous with what the historical Aquinas actually says. However, this doesn't settle the point at issue. To see this, suppose for the sake of argument that I'm right about what the historical Aquinas says, the defender of the theologically expansive sensibility may simply regroup by saying that whether the historical Aquinas says so or not, the right way to understand the principle that theology concerns God and all things in relation to God is in terms that exclude the prospect of metatheology a priori. In other words, the objection against metatheology still has force, even if it turns out not to have its source in the authority of Aquinas. Let's explore this second line of objection. For reasons that should be obvious, it depends on what I shall call a recalcitrant theologically expansive sensibility. Recalcitrant because it involves setting aside Aquinas and digging in one's intellectual heels in order to reframe the point at issue. According to this way of thinking, metatheology is a non-starter because the scope of theology includes matters that fall under prolegomena. This is the part of the study of sacred doctrine that provides introductory material and context for the student. The claim here isn't that there are no foundational matters to consider when coming to the discussion of sacred doctrine. Rather, the concern is that the discussion of such foundational matters are already part of the introductory material one would expect within the bounds of the discussion of matters theological. Returning to my initial characterization of metatheology, the advocate of a recalcitrant expansive sensibility claims that the study of the conceptual foundations of theology, comprising its nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds, obtains within the domain of theology as such. It's a properly theological task, not a philosophical one. The fact that Aquinas disagrees, if indeed he does, alters this point not one whit. Well, what shall we say in response to this? Given what we have seen Aquinas actually says about the matter, it should be clear that the recalcitrant theologically expansive sensibility requires some disambiguation. When we attempt this, we quickly discover that it is the advocate of the recalcitrant expansive sensibility who, according to the follower of Aquinas' scheme at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, seems to be guilty of a category mistake. But we begin to get ahead of ourselves. So let's do what all good scholastic theologians do, and I know everyone in this virtual room today is a good scholastic theologian, and begin to address this concern raised by the advocate of the recalcitrant expansive sensibility by making some conceptual distinctions. Initially then, let us distinguish between theology as the intellectual domain that's concerned with the study of God and all things in God, and divinity as the study of theology from within a confessional context, specifically the context of the Christian tradition broadly construed. Then the study of what Aquinas calls sacred doctrine, which encompasses what today we would think of as distinct subdisciplines like biblical studies, practical theology. All of those fall within the bounds of divinity. For it is the study of theology from a particular vantage, namely the vantage of the Christian tradition, in which it's believed revealed theology is the principal source of authority. Given this way of carving things up, the mistake of the defender of the recalcitrant version of the expansive sensibility is to think that divinity is a domain that encompasses within its bounds all reflection on theology. It would be a bit like the golfer who claims that the Eden estuary in St. Andrews contains all the water of the River Eden, which empties into it. Clearly, that can't be the case. The golfer is mistaken or misunderstands that at any given time there is water running downstream from the mountains through the River Eden, as well as the water that empties into the estuary. Mutatis mutandis, the theologian who claims divinity encompasses within its bounds all reflection on theology is guilty of a kind of intellectual overreach. In fact, divinity encompasses only the parts or aspects of theology that fall under the description of divinity as a confessional discipline. It may be that a given divinity school also has professors who study religion from a social science perspective, or who study the philosophical foundations of theology or whatever. That's all well and good. But it should be clear from this way of thinking that such approaches to the matter of theology do not fall under the description of divinity, strictly speaking. They are ancillary to divinity, understood in this broadly termistic fashion as a kind of confessional theology done within a given tradition. Given these distinctions, we may return to the objection of the defender of the recalcitrant expansive sensibility. It should now be clear that the objector is right that theology is expansive in nature, but wrong to deny that there's no place from which we may reflect on the foundations of theology that's not already theological in the confessional sense. Once we distinguish between theology as such and divinity as the confessional approach to theology, it should be clear that the confessional study of divinity is more restricted than theology as such, and that theology as such can be done out with divinity by those of other faiths or no faith, including philosophers. Okay, let's take stock. I've argued that the defender of a theologically expansive sensibility who thinks that theology concerns God and all things in God, in relation to God, has things at best half right if this principle is thought to be original to Aquinas. When we consider what Aquinas actually says, it's clear that he thought theology is a subject that comprises the subject matter of sacred doctrine and methods associated with its study in revealed theology, which includes, biblical studies, history of doctrine, dogmatics, practical theology. But, says Aquinas, theology is also studied in metaphysics. So theology is not the same as the study of sacred doctrine, and the study of theology may be pursued outside the bounds of the study of sacred doctrine in philosophy. I've suggested that a key difference that seems to inform Aquinas' way of thinking is between the confessional approach to theology and a non-confessional approach. The confessional approach is in important respects tradition-specific, as we moderns would say. The non-confessional approach is not tradition-specific. That seems to be a principled way of distinguishing the study of theology as such from confessional approaches to theology. With this in mind, I then considered the recalcitrant expansive sensibility of those who argue that metatheology is a non-starter because there's no non-theological view from nowhere from which to reflect on the conceptual foundations of theology, irrespective of what Aquinas says. This, I argued, depends on a category mistake, which is ironic, given that it's a mistake that the defenders of the recalcitrant expansive sensibility accuse the metatheology advocates of committing. The category mistake in question is, as I've outlined it, to conflate theology as a broad reflection on God and all things in God with a particular intellectual discipline, namely divinity. Once we see this, we see that the study of theology is not coextensive with the study of divinity, and that it's possible to study theology outside the confessional bounds of divinity and its concerns with revealed theology in philosophy. And as an aside, presumably and by extension, this is also true of the modern social scientific study of theology, where theology is the object of study rather than the study of religious phenomena, practices, or beliefs. Such developments post-date Aquinas, but it would not be difficult to adjust our description to include them. Okay, suppose this is right as far as it goes. It still doesn't address the question of whether metatheology is a desirable, appropriate, or even feasible activity. That is, even if the objector is minded to concede the point about Aquinas exegesis and concede the point about the distinction between divinity and theology as such, this in and of itself doesn't show that metatheology is desirable, appropriate, or feasible. To see what I mean, consider an example from the social sciences. In the study of law, we have a division between those who study black letter law, as it's sometimes called, in order to pursue legal cases, and those who study the philosophical foundations of the law, that is, jurisprudence or legal theory. The practitioners of jurisprudence are concerned with the philosophy of law, and there are many scholars working in that field. But not all of them are qualified lawyers. Many are what we might call theoretical lawyers, as opposed to practical lawyers, those who practice law on a daily basis as advocates or solicitors or barristers or attorneys. Think of the difference between theoretical magicians and practical magicians adopted by Susanna Clarke in her sublime novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, for those who've read it. It's just that sort of a distinction that I have in mind here. One could be both a practical and a theoretical lawyer, of course, but the point is that there's a distinction to be made between the two, one that depends on a real division of labor within the study of law itself. This division is between those concerned with the practice of law as we have it, and those concerned with the foundations of the law itself. Now, it seems clear to me that those who study jurisprudence are normally theoretical lawyers, or at least when they're engaged in the activity of jurisprudence, they're theoretical lawyers, not practical lawyers. What's more, jurisprudence concerns itself with the theoretical foundations of the law in a way that the practicing lawyer normally doesn't. There's a place for both sorts of lawyer, but they do different though related tasks. When pursuing a criminal case that relies on black letter law, one turns to the services of a practical lawyer, not a theoretical one, and with good reason. We need the advice of one who deals with black letter law in prosecuting criminal cases, not with the philosophical assumptions that underpin the black letter law in the first place. Transpose this distinction into the study of theology. Divines study theology, but so do philosophers. Those studying theology as divinity students study theology in a confessional manner, presuming the content of sacred doctrine. Those who study theology as philosophers don't. They're only concerned with arguments concerning the philosophy of theology. Recall that theology in this context isn't the same as divinity. Theology is that general term that's shared between philosophers and divines. Divinity is the discipline studied by divines. Theologians may be divines, but theologians may also be philosophers doing philosophical theology. And this is a distinction, indeed, that used to be observed when we thought of things in terms of natural theologians and divines. Anyway, thus on this way of thinking, it's perfectly appropriate for philosophers to study the subject matter of theology. Well, so far so good. What then of metatheology? Where does that land? And here we pass decisively from ground clearing to theological construction. In my view, it lands at the borderlands between divinity and philosophical theology, which is why it's a disputed topic. Like anything that straddles the borders between two disciplines, its provenance will be the subject of dispute. But on my way of thinking, not only is theology proper studied by scholars out with divinity, the study of the foundations of theology is also a matter that's properly a philosophical issue. It is, as I've intimated earlier, the philosophy of theology. Return to Aquinas again. His concern was with sacred doctrine, or what, from the vantage of an ancient Scottish university here in St Andrews, I'm calling divinity. It's appropriate to investigate the subject matter of Christian doctrine from within divinity, but reflection on the foundations of divinity takes us outside the discipline, strictly speaking. To put it in the terms used by Aquinas, the practitioner of metatheology reflects on the subject matter of sacred doctrine from the vantage of philosophy. Now, here's a complication. Metatheology is practiced by both divines and by philosophers. In a similar manner, jurisprudence is practiced by practical lawyers as well as theoretical lawyers. One can be a practical lawyer and reflect on the foundations of the law. In a similar manner, one can be a divine and have an interest in philosophical theology or in first philosophy. Our intellectual promiscuity as scholars, which is surely something to be celebrated and embraced rather than denigrated and eschewed, nevertheless has a tendency to occlude the difference on which metatheology depends. I'm suggesting that metatheology is in fact the philosophy of theology, and that such an intellectual activity can be both helpful and productive for practitioners of divinity, just as theoretical legal study can be helpful to practical lawyers trying to measure up to standards of justice in the way they practice the law. This doesn't amount to an argument in favor of the conclusion that metatheology is the philosophy of theology. Rather, it's an attempt to recommend a particular conception of metatheology as the philosophy of theology. In order to do so, we've had to clear some conceptual space of alternatives to make room for this way of thinking about the matter. So, on my way of thinking, we have the following distinctions, and here's 4 of them. Theology. That's the study of God and all things in relation to God, theology as such. Divinity. That's the confessional study of theology as such, from within the Christian tradition, that's concerned with the content of sacred doctrine in revealed theology. The study of sacred doctrine includes aspects of biblical studies, historical theology, systematic theology or dogmatics, and practical theology. Philosophical theology. That's a non-confessional approach to questions of theology as such, that's concerned with the application of non-confessional philosophical methods to theological topics, such as in the metaphysics of theism. And finally, 4th, metatheology is the study of the conceptual foundations of theology as such, namely its nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds. Now, as a final thought on this matter before turning to the question of progress in theology via the analytic theology question, it might be thought that one could have a stipulative definition of theology as the study of God and all things in relation to God, and hold that metatheology is just the study of the conceptual foundation of theology, in other words, its nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds, and leave it at that. In other words, one might leave open the question of whether the study of the conceptual foundations of theology is a properly philosophical or theological task within the purview of first philosophy or divinity. My thought is that still betrays a conceptual muddle. We would, I think, be better off saying that divines do metatheology and philosophers may do, divines may do metatheology and philosophers may do metatheology, while acknowledging that metatheology is, in point of fact, the philosophy of theology, not divinity, strictly speaking. Okay, that's the end of the first section. Let's turn then to analytic theology and metatheology. At this juncture, the discerning reader or listener may be wondering how this conception of metatheology fits with analytic theology. For, so it might be thought, metatheology sounds a lot like analytic theology. Yet given my characterization of it, metatheology is not confessional theology or divinity, but the philosophy of theology. Analytic theology is also sometimes described in those terms. But does that mean that analytic theology is not a species of confessional theology after all, contrary to some of the claims that I myself have made in print? No. In earlier publications, I've argued that analytic theology may be practiced as what John Webster calls theological theology, which in other words is confessional theology or divinity. But analytic theology may also be practiced as philosophical theology by philosophers. In fact, on the previous published way of thinking I've articulated about analytic theology, that way of thinking underscores the point I'm making here about metatheology. And the point is this: theology is not a term that designates a subject-specific discipline. It might be characterized, as per the expansive sensibility, as a study of God and all things in relation to God. But this, as Aquinas points out, includes aspects of philosophy as well as much of the theology done in theology departments and faculties in universities, divinity schools, and seminaries the world over. In a similar fashion, analytic theology is just a method of doing theology, which doesn't commit its practitioner to substantive theological claims. So analytic theology can be done qua philosopher, as philosophical theology, in the way that Aquinas suggests in the case of theistic metaphysics. It can also be done, and is being done, by those interested in other areas of philosophy, such as philosophical ethics, epistemology, logic, and so forth. I applaud this work. Florient professores, floriat academia. But analytic theology may also be done qua divine. It's unfortunate that in modern English, we commonly use the term theology to demarcate a particular intellectual discipline, because that leads to confusing theology as such with its practice in a particular context, that of divinity. Nevertheless, as I understand it, theology is practiced in the discipline of divinity as a confessional mode of studying theology that's beholden to the authority of the Christian tradition and scripture. Now, analytic theology can be done in this manner as well by systematic theologians who use the tools, methods, sensibilities, and literature of the recent Anglo-American philosophy in pursuit of the goals of theology under the aegis of divinity. Thus, analytic theology tracks the more general term theology. This is because analytic theology is just a mode of studying theology using the tools, methods, sensibility, and literature of the analytic philosophical tradition in order to do so. Is it still philosophy if such a method is transposed from the groves of the academy into the hallowed halls of divinity? I say not if in the process of doing so, it's clear that the philosophical tools, methods, sensibility, and literature beloved of analytics is being brought in as ancillary to the study of sacred doctrine. And after all, isn't that just the sort of thing Aquinas has in view in the beginning of his great Summa? There's nothing stopping the student of sacred doctrine from using philosophy. The point is that it has a subordinate role in such contexts under the authority of divine revelation. Thus, analytic theology may be pursued in divinity as a species of systematic theology. If that were not the case, then no systematic theology would be possible in divinity, because all systematic theology borrows philosophical concepts in order to furnish its arguments. The question is not whether systematic theologians help themselves to philosophical tools, methods, or arguments when it suits them. Clearly they do so as a matter of course, borrowing whatever they need in order to pursue their particular theological goals. The question is whether in doing so, the systematic theologian does anything untoward. In my view, they don't do anything inappropriate, provided the philosophy they borrow has a handmaidenly role, which is precisely the kind of role envisaged by Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae. With that, we turn from the demarcation of metatheology and analytic theology to the vexed and disputed question of progress in theology in our third section. One important, or some might say perennial question for metatheology concerns whether there's progress in theology, or even what progress in theology would look like. This is a metatheological concern, provided it falls under the description of metatheology given in the previous section. And I presume that discussion of progress in theology does, at least in part, raise issues about the conceptual foundations of theology. In other words, whether it's a progressive discipline that accumulates knowledge over time, as well as about its nature, aims, methods, scope, and bounds. Here, as in the previous section and following Aquinas' lead, I will distinguish between theology as such, which is a broad category that's not discipline-specific, and philosophy and divinity as particular subject areas in which theology may be studied. Now, it might be thought that theology as such is not progressive in the same way that, say, the natural sciences might be thought to be progressive. On this way of thinking, the natural sciences are progressive because they amass data through hypothesis and experimentation that generates a body of knowledge about the physical world that is cumulative. And the idea here is that the natural sciences examine physical data about the world around us that can be tested and subjected to experiment and measurement on the basis of the scientific method. Natural scientists see something puzzling the world, form a predictive hypothesis to explain the puzzle, test the hypothesis through experiment, and draw appropriate conclusions from the experimental data in relation to the hypothesis, and adjust or refine the hypothesis in light of their findings. Now, this rather neat way of characterizing progress in the natural sciences is, to say the least, contested. In the past few generations, great volumes of ink have been spilt by philosophers of science and sometimes by practicing scientists reflecting on their own disciplines, which have made this rather simplistic picture of scientific progress appear rather problematic. Here is not the place to pursue that matter. Instead, I will use this kind of toy version of scientific progress because it's still often trotted out in popular culture as a paradigm of intellectual progress that theology cannot hope to emulate. Now, our analysis of the lie of the land in theology presumes that theology is a truth-aimed and truth-apt enterprise. In this sense, it's a realist enterprise in the way that, say, astrology is not. That is, theology is aimed at truth about God and all things in relation to God, and it's an apt way of getting at matters of theological truth. However, truth in theology is very much a matter of attending to the object of theology, which is God. In philosophy, this is pursued in philosophical theology, which includes some work done in analytic theology. Philosophical theology uses ratiocination in order to arrive at truths about God, for example, whether God exists, what the nature of God consists in, and so on. Divinity pursues the claims of truth via divine revelation communicated in Scripture and refracted through the Christian tradition. This yields Aquinas' sacred doctrine, among other things. But notice that in philosophy and divinity, the pursuit of theological truth involves the attempt to get at or understand the object of theology better. If that is right, then progress understood in terms of the accumulation of more knowledge or a greater number of truths concerning the object of theology should, in principle, be an anticipated outcome. But other things being equal, it seems reasonable to presume that a truth-aimed discipline has the ambition of accumulating truths over time. Nevertheless, theology as pursued by philosophers and divines is not calibrated like the natural sciences. It doesn't proceed on the basis of hypothesis and experimentation. There's no theological analog to the scientific method. But that's not terribly surprising. After all, as our discussion in the previous sections demonstrated, methodological concerns are usually discipline-specific in important respects. Thus, at least some of the social sciences do not necessarily proceed on the basis of a scientific method either, but we don't think that they're any the worse for that. To see this, let's return to our earlier example of law. As previously indicated, in the Anglo-American tradition, the law is a body of material, much of which is written down in statute and black-letter law, to which the practical lawyer has to attend. The body of law in a given jurisdiction is a collection of testimony, commentary, and judgments that function as the main source of authority for drawing legal conclusions and for making further law. This textual tradition can be amended and changed, and does to some extent evolve over time, so that legal codes become more sophisticated or are refined, or in some cases laws are removed or held in abeyance. Laws from previous eras can sometimes seem hopelessly arcane or immoral to the modern ear. Think of the penalties that used to be applied to those who stole a loaf of bread, or who were thought to be witches, or discovered to be practicing homosexuals. Nevertheless, plausibly, there is a kind of stable core to the law built around certain principles about what we take to be appropriate behavior in our societies, much of which has a religious basis, despite the protests of some modern legal positivists. Yet it's also clear that new law and revisions to the law are made not on the basis of something like the scientific method, but by something much more like trial and error, as well as changing social mores. Thus, we no longer think homosexual behavior between consenting adults should be illegal, or that those who are pagans or Wiccans should be prosecuted for their religious practices, and so forth. And we've come to these views because, as communities and societies, we no longer consider such practices to fall under the description of criminal behavior. Theology is much more like this, I think. This is true in how it's practiced in both philosophical theology and divinity, but particularly in divinity. Like the law, divinity is a discipline that attends to an authoritative tradition, much of which is written down. And like the law, divinity has to do with the way in which the tradition is expressed institutionally. In the case of the law, the institutions are the legal and social organs of the state, that is, the courts and parliament, and ancillary entities such as Inns of Court, faculties of advocates, legal chambers, and the like. In the case of divinity, the institution is the church and her liturgies. Although there are also associated institutions like seminaries that serve the church, it's principally the church and her liturgies that represent the institutional heart of Christianity as it's been expressed from the earliest times to the present. Well then, where might progress be found in the study of theology? In a sense, the answer is implicit in what Aquinas says at the beginning of the Summa. If the subject matter of divinity is sacred doctrine, broadly construed, perhaps progress can be measured in terms of developments in our understanding of the depositive revelation, which is the major source of authority for sacred doctrine, and then the doctrines that are developed on the basis of revealed theology, as well as in the reception and development of sacred doctrine in catechesis and tradition. Then, like the law, divinity makes process through interrogating and engaging a body of traditions, some of which is written down. Progress is measured in relation to a complex of things. Our understanding of that tradition, our development of ways of relating and reflecting on it in tension with other non-theological specific considerations, such as those provided by broader culture and other related disciplines as they bear on the subject matter of theology, such as the natural sciences and so on. It seems to me that there's good evidence of such progress. To take just one example, the way in which the dogma of the Trinity developed in the first 5 centuries of the life of the Church, culminating in the Nicene-Constantinopolitan dogma of 385 AD, was a significant matter. But though this provided a kind of dogmatic framework for subsequent discussion of the Trinity, our understanding of the mystery of the Trinity has continued to develop through further theological reflection and the proposal of new ways of thinking about key aspects of the dogma, and even new models of thinking about the Trinity, such as the hylomorphist constitution model recently produced in Analytic Theology by Jeff Brower and Michael Ray. But suppose it's the study of the theology from a philosophical perspective that's in view. There's no formal body of authoritative texts on which philosophers reflect in formulating arguments about God and all things in relation to God. And in many cases, philosophers are still discussing versions of philosophical arguments that have an ancient pedigree. Think, for example, of standard arguments for the existence of God in an introduction to the philosophy of religion course. But where philosophy pays attention to particular theological traditions in philosophical theology, it may be that progress is more obvious because it tracks developments in the tradition. So in a sense, it seems to me that although philosophical reflection on theology can be and is done without paying much attention to data from a given religious tradition, in practice in philosophical theology, it's often parasitic on data provided by the tradition in view. Thus, the prospects for metatheological progress depend in some respects on progress in a religious tradition, such as that provided by the study of theology and divinity. To conclude, in this essay, I've given some account of metatheology in dialogue with several alternatives. Using Aquinas' discussion in the Summa Theologiae as a point of departure, I've argued that we can distinguish between theology as such, which is a non-discipline-specific approach to the question of God and all things in relation to God, that spans divinity and some aspects of philosophy. Divinity is the confessional study of theology from within the Christian tradition, and metatheology is the study of the conceptual foundations of theology, which seems to me best understood as the philosophy of theology, that is, philosophical reflection on the foundations of theology. So practitioners of metatheology may be philosophers or divines. I then applied this to analytic theology to show that analytic theologians can be engaged in metatheology despite the fact that A, metatheology is the philosophy of theology, and B, not all analytic theologians are philosophers or practicing philosophy when they do analytic theology. One can do both analytic theology and metatheology, this despite the fact that analytic theology can be pursued from within the bounds of divinity, whereas metatheology cannot. Finally, I applied this reasoning to the question of progress in theology. I argued that the study of theology as such may be progressive, depending on how it's pursued. Progress in disciplines that are organized around authoritative traditions is different from progress in disciplines that use the scientific method, but that doesn't mean there's no progress in such disciplines. We talk of progress in the study of law, and in a similar manner, we can talk of progress in divinity based on dogmatic reflection on the deposit of divine revelation and the associated practices of the Church and its liturgy. Thus, dogma is in principle capable of a progressive analysis, and the Christian tradition itself may be analyzed in similar terms, as I've already indicated. Progress in philosophical reflection on matters theological is less apparent, although philosophical theology that tracks the content of a given tradition may benefit from having access to developments in the tradition that may be the subject of philosophical analysis. Nevertheless, it's not clear to me, at least, that philosophical theology is progressive in the same way that divinity is, at least in principle. This is hardly the last word on the topic of metatheology or on progress in theology. If anything, I hope it might be a stimulus for further work in the area. For, so it seems to me, we all benefit from a greater understanding of the way in which we approach a subject as expansive and as existentially vital as the question of God and all things in relation to God. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for your, is the mic on? Yeah? Let me just go ahead. Yeah, so thank you very much for your lecture. I think we've got 25 minutes or so for a couple of questions and answers. So who would like to go first, either at home or in this room?